Chapter 8, September 2nd, 1793. I smelled the breath of death for the first time since all this hardship began, and was scared. Diary of J. Henry C. Helmuth, Philadelphia, 1793. From the time that Colette Ogilvy collapsed, the church bells of Philadelphia tolled without cease. Guns were fired on the street corners, and a cannon blasted in the public square to purify the air. On top of that, we suffered the constant buzz of mosquitoes, blowflies, and hornets. The din was maddening. The day after our ill-fated tea party, Mother sent a note to the Ogilvys inquiring about Colette's health, but received no response. They had disappeared. She also sent a note to the Luddingtons. No word from them either, thank heavens. Many of the wealthy families were fleeing. We were lucky to get 4 or 5 customers a day. Mother worried even more than usual, but I was too hot to care. A violent thunderstorm on Sunday cleared the air for a few hours, but when the sun came out on Monday, it baked the streets until the rainwater rose in ghostly plumes of steam. I felt like a noodle overboiled in the stew pot, and the bells continued to toll. I'm going to climb the church tower and cut the tongues out of those bells myself, Eliza grumbled as she beat a dozen eggs. Hand me the nutmeg, child. I passed her the small grater. Don't you have something to do? She asked. It's hot enough in here without an extra body breathing on me. What did your mother say before she left? I'm waiting for Grandfather to finish his business in the necessary. He said I could go with him to the newspaper office. Eliza scowled and waved a towel at the flies buzzing above the bowl. Pick me some fresh asparagus grass. These pests are a plague. The bright sun blinded me as I stepped outdoors. The garden looked distressingly poor, even with all the watering I had done and the brief rain. It was a good thing we were able to buy at the market. The asparagus grass grew along the back fence. I gathered a handful of fronds, cut them at the base, and tied the bunch tightly with a piece of twine. Back in the kitchen, I stood on a chair and hung them from an iron hook in the center ceiling beam. There, I said, pushing the chair back against the wall. That should discourage the flies. Thank you. Taste this pudding and tell me if it's right. I chewed and pondered. It needs more sugar. You think everything needs more sugar. Eliza wiped the sweat off her face with a handkerchief. I think that tea with the Ogilvy sisters affected you. Maybe you would be right for their Edward. She stirred the fire and lay on more wood. Wasn't that long ago folks didn't have any sugar. No coffee or tea either. Please, Eliza, not another history lesson. I'll scream. Eliza harumphed and set the pudding over the fire. Don't know which is worse, you moaning or your mother staring out the window, hoping someone will walk in and lay a shilling on the table. We have ugly days ahead of us. No sugar for anyone, rich or poor. No, no. I fanned myself with the wooden spoon. Grandfather says this trouble will soon be over. He says people don't have gumption anymore. Eliza mumbled something under her breath that I couldn't quite hear. When it came to strong-headed opinions, Eliza, my mother, and my grandfather were evenly matched. She untied her apron and hung it from the hook. Where are you going? I asked. Grandfather and I could run any errand you need. Not this errand, you couldn't. Eliza reached for her pretty straw hat. The Free African Society is having a meeting about the fever. It should prove a lively gathering. I'll return in time for supper. Out back, the door of the necessary slammed. Matty Cook, called Grandfather. Must I wait all day? Andrew Brown's print shop smelled of ink and grease and the sweat of muscular apprentices carrying trays of lead type from the composing table to the printing press. When I was a child, Mr. Brown let me pick out letters and set them in the form. It had been a thrill seeing my words in print. The printer issued no invitation to me that morning. He was deep in conversation with Mr. Karras as we entered. What news, William? Mr. Brown asked. Packed your bags for a trip to the country? He wiped his hands on his apron and sent an apprentice for a bucket of ale. Grandfather banged his cane on the floor. I didn't run from the redcoats, and I won't run from a dockside miasma. What is wrong with people, Andrew? We suffered all kinds of disease in our youth, but folks were sensible. They didn't squall like children and hide in the woods. Mr. Karras cleared his throat. If the yellow fever were a soldier, you'd run it through with your famous sword and sit down to a hearty dinner. But there may be cause for caution, old friend. Listen to the mayor's orders, which Andrew has just printed. He picked up a broadsheet and read. On advice from the College of Physicians. Number 1. All persons should avoid those that are infected. Number 2. The homes of the sick should be marked. Number 3. Sick people should be placed in the center of large, airy rooms without curtains and should be kept clean. Number 4, we must supply a hospital for the poor. Number 5, all bell tolling should cease immediately. 6, the dead should be buried privately. 7, the streets and wharves must be kept clean. 8, all persons should avoid fatigue of the body and mind. 9, all persons should avoid being in the sun, drafts, and evening air. 10, all persons should dress appropriately for the weather. 11, all persons should consume alcohol in moderation. I'm glad they'll stop ringing the bells, I said. Sensible advice, most of it, Grandfather said. Still, I don't understand why so many run scared. They've taken over Ricketts Circus building on the 12th Street to house the poor, said Mr. Brown. Isn't that why we have an almshouse? Asked Grandfather. The almshouse is closed. They want to protect their residents from the disease. So the fever victims lie on the floor of Ricketts with little water and no care. Once a day they remove the bodies for burial. A neighbor threatened to burn the place down if the sick are not removed, explained Mr. Karras. But where will they go? Asked Grandfather. No one knows. I hadn't heard about that. They were burying fever victims every day. How many have died, Mr. Karras? I asked. He turned to Mr. Brown. How many dead, Andrew? Mr. Brown shrugged. It's hard to say with certainty. I've heard several hundred at least, said Mr. Karras. Grandfather paused. Even a few hundred isn't enough to call it an epidemic, he said. Some doctors warn we may see 1,000 dead before it's over. There are 40,000 people living in Philadelphia, William. Can you imagine if 1 in 40 were to die? The room quieted as we all pondered the number. I don't believe it, said Grandfather finally. People exaggerate. What news from our friend Evans? Mr. Brown looked up. His wife is ill, and he has closed his shop. My business dwindles daily. I've already lost one of my lads, gone with his family to Wilmington. Mrs. Ogilvy said that everyone of fashion has fled to their country estates, I offered. I heard one of her daughters was stricken, said Mr. Brown. Myself, I straddle a fence. One foot stays here in Philadelphia. The other foot is in the country. We know the air there is pure and the people safer. I say safer, mind, not safe. There are reports of fever in Bucks County and Delaware. What of the government, then? Grandfather asked. Jefferson still comes into town every morning, though everyone says he'll soon quit and retire to his farm at Monticello, said Mr. Karras. Bah! We don't need Jefferson. We have the general. President Washington won't abandon us. Mr. Karras blew his nose loudly. The president retires to Virginia for a respite every September. He is not a man to change his habits. Even if he called the Congress back, few would dare return. I tell you, William, men who stood unafraid before British cannon run in fear from this foul pestilence. I fear for Philadelphia. I fear for the people. I fear for myself. Grandfather did not say a word as we walked home. I silently counted on my fingers. 28 days until the end of September, then on into October until the first frost. Frost always killed fever. Mr. Karras said it drained the poison from the air. The Luddingtons were sounding better. Slopping pigs couldn't be much harder than serving in the front room, and it would be better than falling ill or dying. I'd be there over harvest. They would make me work in the fields and feed me bread and water, but I wouldn't get sick. Grandfather stayed silent until we approached a limping man dressed in dark rags pushing a cart. Wonder where that fellow's going, he said. Looks like he belongs on the waterfront. A thin, white arm flopped over the side of the cart as it jostled over the cobblestones. Hello there, good man, called Grandfather. There's no place for the dead up here. Hello? The man ignored us and pressed on steadily. Perhaps he's transporting a poor woman to Ricketts Circus, like Mr. Karras said, I suggested. She should be moved at night when good people are safe in their beds. Now what is he doing? The man had stopped at the corner of High and 7th in front of our coffee house. Grandfather sped up. Sir, I must protest most vehemently. I lifted my skirts and ran ahead of Grandfather. An unnamed fear shot through me. My eyes filled with tears. No, this is too much, Grandfather called angrily. Sir, he shouted, take that away from my home. Off with you now and take your cargo or I should call the constable. The man turned and looked at Grandfather. then lifted the handles of the wheelbarrow and dumped the woman on the street. "Mother!" I screamed. Chapter 9. September 2nd, 1793. He's the best physician that knows the worthlessness of most medicines. Benjamin Franklin. Poor Richard's Almanac, 1733. I stood dumbly while Grandfather knelt by Mother's side. "She's alive," he said. "Take her feet, Mattie. We must get her inside." Eliza screamed as we carried Mother through the front door. She dropped a clay pitcher on the floor. It shattered into bits. "Is she—" "She was overcome by the heat," said Grandfather. "She'll be fine after a short rest. That's all she needs, a short rest." Mother didn't open her eyes until we tucked her into bed. She looked around in confusion. "You fainted," Eliza explained. "It's what you get for working too hard," added Grandfather. I waited for Mother to throw off the quilt and scold us. Instead, she shivered. "I'll sleep a few moments, then I'll feel better," she said, patting my hand. "Go downstairs, Matilda. Be useful." Something was desperately wrong. Mother was sleeping in the middle of the day. I wanted to stay and watch over her, but Eliza and Grandfather shooed me out of the room. There was no time to argue. A customer banged through the front door and called for something to drink. Nothing went right that afternoon. The coffee urn leaked. The biscuits burned in the oven. I dropped an entire drawer of tea leaves on the floor. The gentlemen were all quarrelsome and fractious. I snuck upstairs once, but Mother still slept. Eliza gave me what for when she caught me. As I cleared the dirty mugs off the last table, Grandfather stood deep in conversation with Mr. Rowley. I motioned to Eliza. "Isn't he a doctor?" I asked. Eliza shook her head. "Not a proper physician, but he sees sick folk and prescribes medicines. All the real doctors are down on Water Street. It's been a terrible day there. They say bodies are piling up like firewood." "I don't believe it." "Shush," said Eliza. "I heard it at the society. If Reverend Allen said it, you can believe it's the truth. Here they come." Grandfather introduced Mr. Rowley. I curtsied. "Mr. Rowley here has vast experience treating female complaints," said Grandfather. "He'll get Lucille back on her pins in no time." I had my doubts. His hands were uncommonly dirty, and he smelled of rum. It seemed immodest to let a strange man into our bedchamber, but Grandfather and Eliza showed him in to see the patient. I followed close behind. He first took Mother's pulse, then felt the skin on her ankles and wrists, then peered down her throat and under her eyelids. He worked without a word, grunting occasionally and making a tisking sound with his tongue. Mother did not wake. I wanted to throw a bucket of water in her face. It was against the laws of nature for her to lie in bed with the sun so high. At last Rowley rose from the bed. We waited for him to speak, like a congregation expecting the minister's benediction. "It is not yellow fever," he said. Grandfather sighed in relief. "But Dr. Rush says yellow fever is spreading everywhere," Eliza said. "Dr. Rush likes to alarm people," Mr. Rowley replied. "There is a great debate about this pestilence. Yesterday, a physician I shall not name diagnosed yellow fever in an elderly woman. Her family threw her into the street. She died, but she didn't have yellow fever. It was all a mistake. I use the diagnosis sparingly, and I assure you there is no fever in this house." Grandfather beamed. "See, Matilda, I was right. We have no cause to run out of the city like children scared by a ghost. Lucille will be scolding us by sunrise," he chuckled. Rowley wagged his finger at Grandfather. "I wouldn't predict that," he said. "She'll need more than a good nap to recover. Be sure to bathe her every 4 hours and keep her clean and cool. I'll give some remedies to your servant. And now," he said, holding out his hand and showing his gray teeth, "my fee." Giving my mother a bath fell upside down and backside front. I didn't want to do it. Daughters aren't supposed to bathe their mothers, but Eliza could not manage alone. We moved my bed to Grandfather's chamber and replaced it with the tin bathing tub. Every 4 hours we filled the tub with hot water mixed with the black pepper and myrrh. The worst part was dragging Mother from her fitful sleep and getting her to sit in the water. The fever had taken hold of her senses, and she wept, calling my father's name. While Mother dozed in the tub, we stripped the linen from her bed and laid on fresh. She was supposed to drink Dittany tea sweetened with molasses, but it tasted too horrible. As soon as we had her back in bed, Eliza emptied the tub and put more water on to boil. Mother shivered so hard her teeth rattled. Even with all the blankets in the house on her, she could not warm. She lay under the faded bedding like a rag doll losing its stuffing, her hair a wild collection of snakes on the pillow, her cornflower blue eyes poisoned with streaks of yellow and red. It hurt to look at her. After the sun set, Eliza set a candle by her bed. "Your grandfather is sleeping at old man Karras's house," she explained. "Just as well," I said. "Are you going home?" "I must," she said. "My brother is expecting me." I nodded. Eliza lived with her brother's family. They would be very worried if she didn't come home. "I'll be fine," I said. "I think she'll sleep through the night." Eliza kissed my forehead. "Don't forget your prayers," she said. "I'll come early and try to bring a doctor with me." After she left, I locked the doors and closed the shutters. A church bell struck 10 times, and I shivered. The coffee house was filled with shadows and dark noises. I took 2 extra candles from the clothes press and hurried upstairs to watch over Mother. She did not notice when I entered the room. Her face was pulled taut in pain, and she jerked in her sleep. I so wanted to touch her. The tops of her hands were roped with muscle and veins, but her skin was wrinkled and soft. Had she ever enjoyed anything? Had every day been a struggle? Perhaps death would be a release, a rest for the weary. A slight breeze waltzed through the room. Silas strolled in and jumped onto the bed. He settled himself so gently by her feet that she did not stir. No mice would disturb her, that was understood. Mother wrinkled her brow and moaned. I smoothed her hair. "I'm here, Mother," I whispered. "Be still." She shook her head from side to side on the pillow. Tears threatened again. I sniffed and tried to control my face. No one could ever tell what Mother thought or felt by looking at her. This was a useful trait. I needed to learn how to do it. There were so many things she had tried to teach me, but I didn't listen. I leaned over to kiss her forehead. A tear slipped out before I could stop it. I quietly sat beside her and opened my psalm book, praying for deliverance, or at least the dawn. I must have dozed off. One moment the room was still. The next, Mother flew off the pillows and was violently ill, vomiting blood all over the bed and floor. Her eyes rolled back in her head. I jumped up from the stool. "Eliza!" I screamed. "Help!" There was no answer. Eliza was gone. I was alone. I forced myself back to the bed. Mother panted heavily. "Everything will be fine," I said as I sponged her face clean. "Just lay still." Her eyes opened and I smiled at her. Tears pooled in her eyes and spilled down her cheeks. She opened her cracked lips. "Go away," she whispered. "Leave me." I recoiled as she leaned over the bed and retched a foul-smelling black fluid onto the floor. "Oh, stop, please stop," I begged. "Leave me," Mother shouted in a ragged voice. "Leave me, go." I tried to help her back onto her pillows, but she pushed me away and shook her head. "Go away," she repeated. I ran sobbing to the window. Breathing in the fresh air helped calm my stomach. The houses along the street were shuttered tight and dark. I had to help her. She was depending on me. "Let me clean you up," I began as I turned away from the window. "You'll feel better again in a clean shift, maybe a bath. Would you like a bath again?" She was breathing as fast and heavy as a runaway horse. Her hand fumbled along the mucky sheet until it found the small book of Psalms I had dropped. "I'll put some water on to boil." Mother threw the book weakly at my head. "Ouch," she croaked. "Don't want you sick. Go away."